NESGameMaker. Today we are going to be going into the transition manager and possibly into the music manager, depending on how much time we got going on. So let's get cracking. First off, let's uncomment that, since we'll need to uncomment it anyways. Create a new object. No, there we go. Create object. Okay, underscore transition underscore manager. And pop it open. Give it a sprite from our sprites. And there you go. Cool little sprite. And I think we need to keep it visible. I'll have to take a look at my code. Reference code, do your stuff. There we go. Yeah. Visible and persistent. We're going to need a create event, a step event, and a draw GUI end. Let's see, let me draw GUI end. All right, there we go. 3 setups. And we'll make sure the code is nice and easy to read. And coming into here, we'll start with our singleton check. And set up some enums here. So we're going to have some transition modes, transition types. You'll recognize this. Again, it's based off the code from Sean Spalding's transition manager way back in the day. And I've continued to use it ever since, and it actually works very well for what I need to do. We have the trans mode, which would be off. Next, go to restart, room reset, intro, quit, depending on what you want your transition, what your transition is supposed to be covering up. And transition type would be what kind of transition you want to have happen. So if you want no transition effect, just have none. If you want a fade, use fade. If you want something else, well, you'd have to insert it in. Count is just kind of a shorthand for this is how many different types there are. So this would be 0, 1, and 2. So that would mean there's 2 different types of transitions available. So we're going to use some information. We need to get the GUI width, GUI height. So make sure this is always created after the camera. That way the camera can set up your GUI width and GUI height beforehand. And of course, if you set up your game so you can adjust the GUI size and stuff, you'll also have to set up your game so that it updates the transition manager's GUI width and GUI height at the same time. So that's something to keep in mind. I agree with half height and half width because the half height and half width are always useful for centering. Mode off because we aren't doing anything. Type none because we aren't doing a transition type right now. Well, it doesn't really matter what you set it to because, well, anyways, intro type and outro type. So I think this is something new that I've set up. You can now have like an intro type and an outro type, so you can have different animations for your intro and your outro when you're leaving the room and when you're going into the next room. You don't see it very much here, but if you were to buy the full transition manager code I have on itch.io, I have about 18 or so different transition types that you can use, and each one of them lets you have a really unique difference. So you could have like a jigsaw puzzles falling onto the screen on one, and then it opens up as triangles from the other side, that kind of thing. It depends on how artistic and fancy you want to get. Alpha target. So this is basically our our target. So we want to go to 1.2. So any alpha values are considered between 0 and 1. 0 being no alpha, being transparent, 1 being fully visible. And anything above, anything below those values are treated as 0 and 1. So if you have 1.2, that will be treated as 1 until such time that it goes underneath 1. So by having it slightly over, that causes a slight delay. So it's just like adding an extra 20% time for it in the delay. So I find that that works fairly well for various things that we do. And this alpha is what the current alpha is set up to be. So it's 0 because, well, we don't want to be drawing anything. And we'll see that in a bit here too as well. Speed, how fast the animation goes. Minimum speed is the minimum speed for how fast we want it to go. And target is the room. So that would be whatever room you want to switch to when you're doing a go to or a next sort of thing. Come over to our step event. We're going to set up a state machine here for the transition manager. Starting off with if mode is equal to transmode.off, then exit. Because if we're in the off transition mode, then there's no need to be running any of this code at all. So don't do it. Then while we're introing, then make sure we use our type. Current type is the intro type. And if we're not introing, if we're outroing or leaving the room, then we should again make sure we update to the outro type. And this is actually buffered up by some scripts we'll get to as well in a little bit here. Switch type default. This approximates the ease out cubic, fast start, slow end. So this is just some mathy stuff that I've been using ever since this got started up. By default, we use this code for our alpha math for determining what the new alpha is going to be. But you could actually set it up by type. So if you wanted to have different math used for each one of the transitions, you could actually change it up here into the different math types you like. And finally, we have the state machine. So if my alpha is greater than or equal to my alpha target, or my alpha is less than or equal to 0, so once we've reached the end of our animation, then do something. So when we start up a transition, what we're going to do is we're going to take the trans mode and we're going to set it from transmode.off to transmode dot let's say go to. So alpha is currently 0 because it's at full transparency. But we're going to start. So once the transition mode has been changed from off to something else, so go to, it's going to come into here and it's going to say, oh, well, we are in not in intro, so we want to use this math here. And this is going to start increasing our alpha from 0 towards our alpha target of 1.2. So we go in here and we say, okay, is alpha greater than or equal to my alpha target? No. Is alpha less than or equal to 0? No. So we don't do anything yet. And it'll just keep doing this until alpha reaches 1.2. At which point, then it will say, oh, alpha is greater than or equal to alpha target. So then it'll jump into this state machine and say, switch mode. So we want to go to. So it changes the mode to intro because we're going to be moving over to the new room right here. And now we need to intro into the new room where our alpha goes from the alpha target, or alpha max if you prefer, back to 0 again. And then it will be going, okay, well, is anything happening? Anything happening? No, nothing's happening. We haven't reached 0 yet. All right, so once you reach 0, then it will say, oh, we're in intro mode. So therefore, we've finished introing into the new room, so we must turn ourselves off. And I put in this little bit of reset, so if the player, well, not the player, but the whoever has programmed this has programmed it so that the speed changes for the transition. If they wanted the transition to be faster for whatever reason than the default speed, then it returns back to the default speed once the transition is over. And you can handle that however you want. You know, if you want to have like a default speed value instead of just having it hard coded as 0.1, get rid of the magic numbers, you could have the default speed. That'd be something useful to have in there. So I think we're pretty good on there. So we have our intro mode, well, we have our next mode where we just go to the next room. This is kind of deprecated since room order isn't exactly as fixed in the 2.3 update versus the previous 2.2 and back. But I mean, it's still useful in some extent. Like, about the only place I use it is here with the intro room. You just go to the next room from the intro room, which isn't very good because again, the next room could be whatever room. It doesn't necessarily have to be the title screen or whatever. So yeah, I don't think I would even use it there anymore. Either if I am, I'll have to make sure I'm not. So yeah, kind of deprecated, but you know, it's still there in case you wanted to use it for whatever reason. Go to goes to whatever your target room. Restart your game. Reset resets the room, and quit ends your game. So I want to make sure that you're clear that stuff like room restart and game restart do not clear variables. So this is something I see a lot of people asking. They kind of like, oh, I restarted my game and everything's doing weird stuff. Well, the answer is because restarting your game does not clear variables. So if you had a global variable that was set to some value at the start of your game, but then you restarted your game, it wouldn't necessarily be reset to the default value because unless you explicitly code it to do so. So you'll end up with weird effects of that doing that kind of stuff. So always keep that in mind when you're doing stuff like game restart and room restart. So last but not least, let's go into the draw GUI end. And this is actually very simple. If transmode.off, exit, because we don't want to be drawing unless we're actually doing something. We have a temporary alpha variable here, which I clamp between 0 and 1. And fade transition, if type is equal to type fade, then draw a black triangle across, well, black square across the entire screen. In this case, I use the draw rectangle pixel function, which is basically the same as draw rectangle, except it's slightly faster because there's some sort of voodoo in the background of GameMaker that, for whatever reason, makes drawing rectangles normally not very fast or efficient. But if you were to instead draw the rectangle using a pixel that you stretch, for some reason that's faster. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. But apparently that's the way it is. I don't use this very often because it's probably minuscule savings that do not actually impact your finished game performance unless you have some sort of highly performance determinative game like Forge, or that you really have to eke out every single last pixel and frame of performance that you possibly can. So yeah. Anyways, that should be everything that you got going here. That should give you a transition manager. Well, that was fun. Let's jump away from both of those. I'm going to take a look at how much time we got going here. Let's see. We are currently at 14 minutes. So let's see. Oh, wait. I didn't go over the scripts here. So actually, come over to scripts. we have a new thing here that I've so in the past, there's some various different things I've done with scripts and how they work. I don't know if I actually explained this to you properly here, but in the past, I used to have everything in a script, and then I'd have this little GML pragma stuff that I would run, but it's no longer, it's now deprecated. You don't need to do that anymore. So we just have a script called defaults where I throw in a bunch of default stuff like declaring stuff like enum for different direction types, for tile types. I randomize the game and set up some sprite fonts and set up globals. This is a kind of fun little thing. So you can actually throw in this little thing, global.debug, and use the parameter string. What it does is it actually looks down here in your compile log, and it looks in here and it says, oh, let's see, parameter string 1, and it looks down here and it says, oh, dash game. I'm looking for dash game, wherever that is. It's somewhere in here. It says dash game, and this only exists when you are compiling from the IDE. And that tells the game that, oh, if that exists, then I want debug to be true because I'm working from the IDE. So that's kind of a fun little trick you can use. Global.pause. I don't really know if I even need that very much anymore because I've set up different pause systems, and in fact my pause system has evolved further than what is displayed in this because now I've set it up so that you can actually do slow motion effects, which will be very fun when you get to that in the future. Sec, useful macros. Sec is game get speed FPS. Tile width 16, size, power 4, and palette swap setup. Palette swap is exactly as it was in the Mega Man tutorial, so you can kind of basically ignore for the most part. So that's the default script. Just yeah, like I said, you don't need to type in pragma anymore because now all scripts are basically treated as if pragma was in there at the start. So they are all executed at the start of the game to check for any executing code that you want to have happen. So instead, what we have now is what I call Lib Object Functions. It's a little bit bigger so we can see a bit easier. And I have these camera functions such as position camera, which is fairly easy to understand. I basically update the camera to be in this XY position. And screen shake, we're not going to go over that because you don't need a screen shake. In this, camera set view position subpixel. It's again something you're not going to have to worry about unless you're actually using subpixels. So we can kind of ignore those. So actually, yes, that'd be right. Shrink that down. Then we have the input object. I actually, this is kind of very important and something I completely glossed over. The player needs to check for various inputs. So you have input held, you put in the player ID and an input action, and it returns global dot input states. It basically just checks into the array that we've set up previously to see if the input type is held. So what we'd actually do here is in the player object, we'd type input held. If input held, player ID, you put 0 for player 1. And underscore input underscore action, it would be input underscore action dot affirmative. Same for all of these. Input clear is actually fairly useful. It's kind of the inverse of these. Instead of checking for an input, you set all the input used to you set the input to none. So it clears it out. This is for like when you press enter to pause the game, but enter also unpauses the game. Well, you don't want to pause the game, then unpause all in the same frame because that kind of defeats the purpose of pausing. So you input the enter to pause the game, then clear the input so that you don't end up unpausing it. Reset input buffer. So this is useful for whenever you input buffer a jump or something, and then, oh, well, it looks like we actually jumped. So therefore, we need to reset the input buffer because we don't need it anymore at this point. Enable and disable input. So swap between the standard and the none input states. Those will be fairly useful. So keep those ones in mind as well. And we have the music object. We'll get around to that soon. But first off, we want the transition object. In this case, what we have here is the fancy transition. So we have our mode. So we do transmode.goto. Outro animation. So transtype.fade. Intro animation, transtype.fade. Target room would be, let's say, room game. And speed multiplier would be whatever you feel like putting in there. Typically I put it as 0.1, but you could put 1 or 5 or 10 or 20 or whatever. If you put it like over 5, it basically means the transition finishes almost instantaneously. So you got to be careful with how you handle that. I could actually redo this to be slightly better, but this is how it is right now until I get to a point where I actually need to worry about it. Transition finished. This is actually useful to check if the transition is over, because once the transition is over, then you would do stuff like go back to the input object and you'd say, okay, once the transition is over, then enable input. Because you don't want the player to be able to click things while you're doing a transition. So you disable the input during a transition as well. And we're going to need these in the future as well for our stats object. All right, so that would leave us our music manager, which we'll do next time, since I spent this time talking about scripts rather than the music manager, and our stats object. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching, and just remember to sign up for the Patreon if you want the base project code all in a nice little package, easy to work for with you. And of course, you can also just sign up with the Patreon because you really enjoyed my code, or you enjoyed the fact that I taught you about Zelda 2, which is a pretty awesome game. So thank you, everybody, and good luck with your programming.